Hear the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Luke. Glory to you, O Lord. The lost son. Jesus went on to say, there was once a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to him, Father, give me my share of the property now. So the man divided his property between the 2 sons. After a few days, the younger son sold his part of the property and left home with the money. He went to a country far away, where he wasted his money in reckless living. He spent everything he had. Then a severe famine spread across that country, and he was left without a thing. So he went to work for one of the citizens of that country, who sent him out to his farm to take care of the pigs. He wished he could fill himself with the bean pods the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything to eat. At last he came to his senses and said, All my father's hired workers have more than they can eat, and here I am about to starve. I will get up and go to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against God and against you. I am no longer fit to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired workers. So he got up and started back to his father. He was still a long way from home when his father saw him. His heart was filled with pity, and he threw his arms around his son and kissed him. Father, the son said, I have sinned against God and against you. I am no longer fit to be called your son. But the father called his servants. Hurry, he said. Bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet. Then go and get the prize calf and kill it, and let us celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine was dead, but now he is alive. He was lost, but now he has been found. And so the feasting began. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ.
Hear the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. The apostles returned and met with Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. There were so many people coming and going that Jesus and his disciples didn't even have time to eat. So he said to them, Let us go off by ourselves to some place where we will be alone, and you can rest for a while. So they started out in a boat by themselves for a lonely place. Many people, however, saw them leave and knew at once where they were going. So they went from all the towns and ran ahead by land and arrived at the place ahead of Jesus and his disciples. When Jesus got out of the boat, he saw this large crowd, and his heart was filled with pity for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. When it was getting late, his disciples came to him and said, It is already very late, and this is a lonely place. Send the people away and let them go to the nearby farms and villages in order to buy themselves something to eat. You yourselves give them something to eat, Jesus answered. They asked, Do you want us to go and spend 200 silver coins on bread in order to feed them? So Jesus asked them, How much bread have you got? Go and see. When they found out, they told him, 5 loaves and also 2 fish. Jesus then told his disciples to make all the people divide into groups and sit down on the green grass. So the people sat down in rows, in groups of 100 and groups of 50. Then Jesus took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looked up to heaven, and gave thanks to God. He broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. Everyone ate and had enough. Then the disciples took up 12 baskets full of what was left of the bread and the fish. The number of men who were fed was 5,000. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Morning. I decided that seeing as my throat was poorly that I'd just show a video for 15 minutes. I didn't tell Philip that. I'm just kidding. We will be showing a video. I absolutely love and adore Lord of the Rings. Lovely. Glad to hear there's another fan in the house. And as we're talking about being lost and found, I don't think there's any 2 people in movie history that have been as lost as Frodo and Sam on their way to Mordor to get rid of the one true ring. We're actually going to show a clip of them almost at the end of their journey. So if we could have that on for us, thank you. Not quite lost, but a long, long way from home. The memory of food, the memory of water, but a distant memory. Their journey so perilous, for a good cause, but perilous, dangerous. They'd suffered so much. And I am one of those fans who just watches a film and doesn't really ask lots of questions about plot and, well, why did they do that? And why didn't this happen? And I've heard people say, well, why did they go through that terrible journey when at the end those 2 big great birds just came and picked them up? Why didn't they just send the birds in the first place and they wouldn't have had the terrible journey? I'll tell you why at the end, but it's a good thing to just think about for the next 15 minutes. If you get bored with me, think about why the bird couldn't have flown them to Mordor. Sam and Frodo long way from home, hungry, thirsty, alone, together, alone. It's not very often that we find ourselves in the same situation of hunger and thirst. I don't know about you, but when I go to work and it gets to about 11 o'clock and I say to my colleagues, oh, I'm absolutely starving. I'm not really, but those beginnings of hunger pains have started. But it's absolutely nothing in comparison to those who feel real hunger and real thirst, which we in our country never can appreciate unless we go through a period of fasting and prayer. When we are lost outside of God's grace, we yearn for fulfillment, like water when you're lost in a desert, like food when you are so hungry. We don't really know, as I've said, what that yearning is like. We can feel those hunger pains at 11 o'clock on a Monday morning as a kind of small reminder of what hunger is. But we don't quite get the full picture the full feeling of it. And in our spiritual lives, we are here. We're here today worshiping God. We already have a sense of being filled with His presence, filled with His love and mercy. We can barely remember the days when we were lost, when we were far away from Him. We can't really remember what it was like to be searching for that fulfillment, to be searching for the missing thing that was in our life, seeking to quench the thirst and the hunger. And people today, people who aren't here, people who are out at the shops or at home in bed or at the gym today, and we seem to forget, we've forgotten that they are searching, that they are hungry, that they are thirsty for something that they don't really know what it is. They don't know that it's God, that it's missing from their lives. And they're trying to fill that hunger, that thirst. They try and find it with something else. Sometimes we do as well. Sometimes we forget that God fulfills our every need. And sometimes we try and fill that hunger and thirst in others. And we fill it with things that we don't need to. I'm not saying any of these things are bad in and of themselves, but as a replacement for God's mercy, for God's filling, when we feel that we're missing something, we can sometimes try and fill it with knowledge, with food, with drink, with drugs, with wealth and status, with sex. And as the prodigal son found on his journey, those things don't really fulfill the hunger and the thirst. They don't really satisfy. Oh, they can for a time. They can be very satisfying for a very, very short time. But it's fleeting, and it goes, and the need arises again and again. And it's like you're in need of a constant fix. And there's another thing that seems to have arisen recently of this need for a fix. I don't know if you've seen in the news, not really recently, but the last time the iPhone 6 came out, and you get the gadget phobe people who go out and they camp for 36, 48 hours a week so that they'd be first in the queue to get the newest gadget, the newest thing. And that is another quest that's endless. Because not long into the future, there will be another new gadget, another new thing that you'll need in order to feel content and happy. And there's always that thing going on in your head saying, I know I'll be happy, I know I'll be content when I get to have the next thing, or when I get my salary up to that level, or when I get that car, that house, that partner, that relationship. And it's all fleeting. That's all part of our being lost. The prodigal son, when he was lost, it took him a while to come to his senses. It took him not until he'd lost all his money. It took him not until all those friends that he'd probably bought had abandoned him. But it took him probably to when his life force was about to ebb away. When he went to work, feeding the pigs, and started thinking, these pigs are fed better than me. I want to eat their food to sustain myself. And it turned him back to his loving father. He'd used up all his own inner resources. He'd tried to solve his problems his way. He'd gone off on his own. He'd spent all his money with wild living, wild women, wild everything else. And had found himself in trouble. And instead of, when he found himself in trouble, of turning to the Father, he tried to solve the problem himself, which Ruth will probably tell me is quite a manly thing to try and do. And it is something that we often try and do ourselves when we find ourselves in trouble with problems. Instead of turning straight to God, we exhaust our inner resources and then, as a last resort, turn to God. Now, the question is, why did he wait so long? Why did he wait till that very last moment when his life force was ebbing away? Is it because he was too independent? Is it because he was too stubborn? Perhaps he was scared of his father's reaction, embarrassed of all that he'd lost, ashamed of his actions. In the end, he decided to go back to his father, to accept the punishment and the shame and the embarrassment of having lost everything, of gone against his father, of against God, and going and facing up to the consequences. And his expectation was of the father of being judging, of the father treating him as a servant than as a son. Even as a last resort of going back down to his father, the father's response to him wasn't one of surprise at the son turning up at the door unannounced. The father hadn't forgotten about his wayward son. He hadn't given up hope on him. He was at the window, looking out with his binoculars, waiting for him to come home to him, wanting him to come home. And when he saw him in the distance, gathered up his cloak and ran out with arms outstretched to meet him, to forgive him, to accept him. When he saw him in that distance, it said that he had pity on him. He knew that his son coming back was at the end of his tether. And he loved him, and he accepted him. And he threw a big party because the son who could have been dead, who had been dead to him, was now alive. Now, I'm not sure if this next bit is partly fever from being ill or spiritual insight. You can decide. I was thinking of the Israelites wandering in the desert, of the manna coming from heaven, of the food feeding them. I thought of Jesus in the wilderness being tempted by the devil. After 40 days of no food and water, of being so hungry, so drained, and being offered a temptation of turning the stone into food and rejecting it. And I thought of the start of Jesus' ministry, of going to the wedding at Cana, of the wine running out, and him giving this gift of the abundant wine for the wedding feast. And then in our other reading today, the feeding of the 5,000. And it struck me the abundance of God's mercy and love and grace towards us. Not only when the prodigal son came back did they accept him, but he threw the best cloak on him, he threw a party for him. He was absolutely exalted in the Father's house. The wedding at Cana, they didn't just have any old wine, but the best wine, and no end of amount of it. It would have watered so many of the guests for such a long time. And then feeding of the 5,000. Not only were they fed to being filled, but the food was overflowing, so the baskets were filled up. And that there was an excess. And there was an excess as well when Jesus died for us on the cross. His body broken, his blood shed for us, to give us new life. His grace abounds with no limits, abundantly generous. And it's difficult sometimes for us to imagine that when we come forward to the communion rail and we get a slither of bread and a sip of wine. And it's hard to imagine the abundance of what that represents, of God's gift, of his grace and mercy towards us. Think of the abundance of sin that it obliterates from us individually. Just individually. Of that moment on the cross, of all the sin that I have committed being wiped out in that one transaction. Think of the abundance of us here in this building today, of that act obliterating our sin. Think of us as a country, of our sin being obliterated. As a world, what about as a human race throughout the whole of history, all who have ever lived, all who ever shall live, the abundance of God's grace and mercy streaming through all generations and all time. And it's mind-boggling. And that's what we remember when we come to the communion rail. When we think of the lost, of the great mercy that God has found us, that God has searched us out and filled us not just with any old bread, but filled us with the eternal salvation bread and wine that he gave for us upon his cross. Our lostness gone, our hunger and thirst sated. And from that, we should gain contentment within our lives. Contentment, not that we don't have good things in our life, but we don't need to fill our lives with everything that the rest of the world does. It's not the same need to be powerful, to have the next gadget, to do all those things that we talked about earlier on, because God fulfills our every need. And in its place, we are given a hunger and thirst for righteousness, for godliness, to look out for others instead of looking out for just ourselves. And it's our choice. It's our choice that we've accepted God into our lives and that we choose to put him as number one. Sam and Frodo made the choice to go to Mordor. They didn't know the difficulties that they were going to face. And the reason why they couldn't have flown on the big birds to Mordor to destroy the ring, because Sauron hadn't yet been defeated. All the while through their journey, if you remember during the film, all the battles that were going on, and one of the final battles was because they were drawing Sauron's eye away from Sam and Frodo to the battle, so they could be protected in their journey. If a big bird had just flown through with them on top of it, Sauron had birds of his own. He had the Wraith Riders who could have come and got him and had the ring for himself, and Sauron would have won. But Sauron is defeated. Jesus defeated Satan. We don't have to wait for Sauron to be defeated. We don't have to wait for Satan to be defeated, because it's already happened. Jesus has already won the victory. We don't have to hunger and thirst. We don't have to be lost in the wilderness. Our choice is to change from reliance on ourselves to reliance on God. It's a choice that the prodigal son made at the end, at the ebb of his life wasted away. He chose to stop relying on himself and rely on God. Let us rely on God more than rely on ourselves. Let him feed us and water us, sate our hunger and thirst. Let him find us every day of our lives. Amen.